most common questions, in fact, other than when is Stormlight 4 coming out? When is Arithmetis 2 coming out? When is the sequel to Elantris coming out, or when the sequel to Warbreaker coming out? Those would be probably the four most common in order of question. The question I get probably the most would be, where do you come up with your characters? Followed very closely by, who is your favorite character? And these are both shockingly hard questions for me to answer. I have a lot of trouble with these because, I teach creative writing. You would think I would be able to talk about where characters come from. I have a class where I blab at people here on campus for hours on end. But character is the hardest one for me to explain. Character for me is done very much by instinct. And when people often ask me this question of where do your characters come from, they do a little find out following it. They kind of nudge and say, do you hear them? Do you hear voices, Brandon? That's really what they want to know, right? They want to know, how does this come about? This sort of, how mystical is it? And the truth is, it's a little bit mystical with characters, but not really. I think a lot of my characters do come from people I know, which means it's dangerous to know me. But usually I'm taking one aspect of the character, and I use that word very intentionally, aspect. I'm taking one aspect of a person I know. For instance, when I was in college here at BYU, I had a good friend whose name was Annie. And Annie was very interesting. She was 6'1", or 6 feet, and she would always talk about how annoying it was to be a woman who was 6 feet tall, because finding clothing that fits you, dealing with guys looking up at you and feeling intimidated, finding people to date, not being able to wear heels on dates, things like this. It was really interesting to me, and she talked about it a lot. I had never even thought about how sometimes our society, when someone doesn't fit what's within the standard of normal, they just feel often like they are that round peg trying to go in a square hole, or vice versa. And I had never considered this idea. Now, when I took that idea, and if you read Elantris, you'll see this is one aspect of a character in that book. It's not like I based the character on Annie. But as I was talking to her a lot and kind of finding out about this one idea of somehow something that I always considered to be an advantage to me, I'm 6'1", to her, she was like, if I could chop 4 inches off, I would. She'd say stuff like that, which was very different to me. And certainly characters come from that aspect. People I know end up in books. A lot of the bridge crew, the ones who, not the main bridge crew members, but the kind of slightly behind the scenes bridge crew members like Dre and Leighton and stuff are all my friends from college. Alan Leighton is still in my writing group, so you'll see Professor Leighton from the Arithmetis show up every now and then, people like that. But it's dangerous to know writers. It really is. You will end up in the books in some way, but it won't be you. It'll just be one aspect of you. Another thing that inspires characters for me is oftentimes, and I don't know if people who aren't writers do this, but I will watch a movie and I'll say, oh, they got that character wrong. Which is kind of a weird thing if you think about it, because no, they didn't get that character wrong. They did that character the way they wanted to, but as an author you're like, oh, they missed an opportunity. If they would have done this character the way I want to do them, their story would have been, different. It would have been the way I want it to be. This happened. I talk a lot about my love of the heist genre. You see a little bit of that showing up in the Legion stories. I really like this format of a story. The team of experts who come together and each lend their expertise and pull off something. Of course, in Legion, it's all pieces of one person's brain forming a one-person sort of team. But the first idea I can remember having for wanting to do a heist story came when I was actually watching Ocean's 11, and I'm like, George Clooney, right? Where's the hard edge? You had a life of crime, you've been to jail. Wouldn't there be a bit of a psychopath behind those eyes? And I've jotted that idea down, and again, they didn't do it wrong. When I phrase it that way, it's mostly for humor. They did the story the way they wanted to, but I thought it would take a kind of messed up person to do this, or someone will get messed up by living a life always conning people, and slowly that developed into Kelsier. The con artist who is kind of a psychopath behind the scenes. Like, he is not, Kelsier is not stable. And I thought that being who he was, that was interesting to me. So where do characters come from? How do they develop? It's just a lot of these different things mixing in my brain. A lot of times people will say, I want to be a writer, what should I do? And as I've been thinking about this more and more, thinking about how to write characters, my response would be, try listening, right? Try listening, because where do the characters come from? The characters don't come from me, they come from everything around me, and I'm listening to it and picking and choosing and putting things together. The origin of the Legion stories came when my friend Dan Wells was working on a book called The Hollow City, which I would recommend to you. It's a very somewhat disturbing look at what it's like to live with schizophrenia. Dan and I both have some friends who have dealt with this, and Dan is very close to it for various reasons, and the book is really good. His take on it is, what if you were schizophrenic, but some of the things you see are real, some of the weird things. So it's kind of like you don't know yourself which of these weird things you're seeing are real and what aren't. We were brainstorming, and I'm like, yeah, that's interesting and weird and all, but what if it were a superpower? Which is kind of how I look at things, right? This founded the basis of the entire middle grade series I wrote, Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarian, which was based around the idea of what if the dumb stuff that my family and I did that everyone thought was lame were actually superpowers in disguise, right? What if being bad with electronics was actually something that you could leverage to your advantage? What if being really bad at math made you a superheroine? This was the sort of thing that spiraled me that, and this is kind of where my mind goes a lot of times. Legion came from me saying, what if the voices you heard helped you? Now, this isn't intended to be a serious look at schizophrenia. In fact, I very pointedly make the very important point in the books, this is not schizophrenia. Whatever Stephen Leeds has, it's more akin to whatever I have that makes me a writer than it is to what schizophrenics really deal with. And that comes out a bit in the third story, which hopefully you guys will enjoy. I've written some essays about it, they're going on my blog, but in some ways, the third Legion story is one of the most personal stories I've ever written. So if you want to know how it is to write characters, what it feels like to plan all these things for them and then to watch terrible things happen to them as an author. If you want to know kind of the author's emotional state, I poured a bit of that into this story. So that kind of brings me to the other question people ask though, which is my favorite? Do I have a favorite? Can I pick a favorite? What is my favorite character? And this stumps me. This stumps me usually more than any other question. Though sometimes, it depends on how much pressure there is to answer quickly. It depends on the age of the person asking. Sometimes if you just say, I don't have one, you can see the young person's face fall when they really wanted you to say, whichever one is your favorite is mine. But there's actually a little bit of truth in that, because every character I write has a piece of me in them. I don't write a character unless there's something about this character that I can pour myself, my life experience into, and I don't ever write a character unless mixed with that is something very different from myself for me to explore. Something that I've gotten from reading or listening or paying attention, a way of seeing the world that is different from the way I see the world that I want to explore. That's what drew me to fiction in the first place. I picked up the very first fantasy novel I read because, and got into it because it reminded me very much of my mother, who saw the world in a very different way from me, and I loved reading this book and getting to know her better. And so, in a way, that answer of whoever is your favorite is my favorite is true because every character has been my favorite at some point. And I think I'll end just by kind of stealing Robert Jordan's answer to this question. Because I once heard it, I think it was on one of the audio CDs of one of his books. After the book, there was an interview with him, and I can't remember if it's from one of those or from one of the other interviews I read, but someone asked him, they said, "Who is your favorite?" And I could tell at least, he got stumped in the way that I get stumped by this question, and finally he gave a really good answer. He said, "You know what? It's whoever I'm writing right now." And that really is it for me. One of the reasons I keep writing, one of the reasons you keep getting all these weird stories is because I am fascinated by stories. And I'm fascinated by telling these stories. And it's the way I explore the world. A lot of people do ask, so about that book Stormlight 4, why aren't we having a Stormlight release party right now? And the answer is because the way I see and explore the world is through experimenting with different stories. I write stories to explore my reality, and Stormlight can certainly do a lot of that, but it can't do everything. It can't let me explore everything, and to be perfectly honest, by the time I release one, I am so burned out on that world. If I were to write the next book right after I finished one, it would probably involve killing everybody and blowing up the world. We talked about Kelsier being a psychopath. I'd be like, die, all of you, no more Stormlight. My whole team is like this. I've talked to Peter about what he thinks of Stormlight books after he's gone through the Gamma read, having had to read a 450,000 word book 5 times in a row or something like this in the space of like 6 months. And he'd be like, kill them all! So, yeah, why is it? Because I want to do different things. And this is how I recharge myself, is by doing these other weird, wacky little stories. And I think you'll see when you read the Legion stories, if you haven't, me experimenting with storytelling styles and with a lot of things. For instance, I really like to do the trick where I try to make sure I can distinguish a character from another character simply by the way they speak, without any viewpoint and without any tags. I do that a lot in the Legion stories. This is me kind of practicing my chops so that I can experiment with different types of storytelling. And then I try to take all of that and apply it to these other big, massive books that I write sometime. So, my answer to you, to those 2 questions, where do your characters come from? They come from everywhere, but mostly from listening. And who is my favorite character? Whoever I'm writing at the moment. And that happens to be actually Spencer from the Skyward books. So I'm almost through book 2 of that. When is your Stormlight 4 coming? Well, I will start writing it on January 1st. This is what I promised myself. And we'll write till it's done. So you can watch on the progress bars to see when that happens. But anyway, thank you guys for coming. I hope you enjoy this book. And we will move to the Q&A portion. So let's see what you guys want to ask me. I've already killed a couple of the questions I get asked the most often. Please try to make sure that your questions do not spoil a book for someone who might not have read it. All right? So, go ahead.
2 quick questions. Are we going to see paperbacks of Alcatraz again?
Are we going to see paperbacks of Alcatraz again? Peter, what do you think? We do not know. We're not 100% sure. Alcatraz 6 is progressing nicely. I would expect once the 6th book is out, maybe we can talk Tor into doing it. So I am not 100% sure.
Second question, who is your least favorite character?
Who is my least favorite character? Cat Swain. Sorry, Cat Swain lovers. See, I can only answer that question because before I picked the books up, I can answer who was my least favorite in the series as a fan. When I was writing them, they all had to be my favorite. And I came to have a lot of respect and love for Cadsuane as a character, but before I picked those books up, I was like, Cadsuane, you're not my real mom. I want my real mom back, and her name is Moraine. So, alright. Oh yeah, Wheel of Time fans. A lot of people read the books and are like, I can tell Cadsuane was his least favorite. Other questions? We'll work our way this way, so we'll do some more over here. Go ahead. What inspired the idea of the lenses from Alcatraz? So the Alcatraz books really did come from me wanting stupid things that I do to be superpowers. And I've always worn glasses. And even when my friends went and got LASIK or contact or something, I was like, nah, I like glasses. I like how they look. I want to wear my glasses. So I wanted glasses to be cool. And so I made a whole bunch of magical pairs of glasses. There is really, if your question, anything about Alcatraz you can ask and say, why did you do this? The answer is almost always, because I wanted something dumb I do to be cool. Other questions? Yeah, in the back, go ahead.
What's your favorite book?
What's my favorite book? This is also kind of a hard one for writers, right? Or maybe not just for writers, maybe just for my type of person. I'm sure a lot of you are like this, where it's like, my favorite book changes and varies, and so I kind of have some go-to answers because they stayed my favorite book for a while. The book that got me into science fiction and fantasy was Dragonsbane by Barbara Hambly, and I often mention that. My favorite Wheel of Time book was book 4. I often mention that. My favorite Terry Pratchett book is probably Going Postal. And so that comes up. My favorite classic is Les Miserables, so that often comes up. What have I read recently that I really like? It's now been over a year, but I really like Jane Yolen's work, and she released a short story collection that I really like. I recently finished Roshni Chachi's book, The Star-Touched Queen, which I really liked. Robert Jackson Bennett is good. I like a lot of different things. I try to read a whole bunch, but there's a few for you. All right, let's do some more questions. Yeah?
2 questions, one is semi-serious. Do you think you'll ever be asked to finish Patrick Rothfuss's series?
No, I think so no, and I would probably say no. My writing style is too different from his. I don't know if I can do the lyrical style that he does. If I were to try, I could probably figure it out, but it would take multiple years of practice, and then it would delay the book even more. I am sure Pat will be able to release his book, and we don't have to worry about that. Now, whether certain other authors will release theirs, I don't know, but if I were a betting man, I would put good money on Pat having his book out in the next decade.
My serious question is, have any of your Cosmere stories started out as something else and then you've pulled them into the Cosmere?
Oh, have my Cosmere stories started as something else and then I pulled them into the Cosmere? You know, I don't do that very often. In fact, I'm trying to think of one that was outside the Cosmere that I pulled into it, and I can't think of one. I have pushed stories out of the Cosmere very frequently. And the reason I do this is because I don't want to be setting things in the Cosmere just because of the Cosmere, right? I want to be setting things in the Cosmere because they work and advance the story of the Cosmere in the way I want it to be. And I want to be sure that I'm not just saying, well, we'll shove this in the Cosmere. And so I very frequently try things out in the Cosmere and then pull them back. One of the main reasons I pull them back is I don't want any connection to Earth in the Cosmere. And so if a book needs a connection to Earth, or if for some reason I like how the connection to Earth works, I will pull it out of the Cosmere. The only thing that I can think of that's been out that went in was Dark One, but then it went out again. So, yeah, go ahead.
Have you published any books that were in the Cosmere that you pulled out?
Have I published any books that were in the Cosmere that I pulled out? Yeah, the Arithmetist is the most obvious example. The Arithmetist started in the Cosmere, and the magic is still very Cosmere. And if I were going to have had one in the Cosmere, it would have been Arithmetist because of the way the magic works. I eventually decided I just did not want to canonize that Earth is in any way, shape, or form related to the Cosmere, and I pulled it out, and I'm glad I did that. But the magic still has a lot of Cosmere remnants to it. Steelheart was never in the Cosmere, that one never was. So yeah. All right, we'll go here, and then we will get to the center. You go ahead.
Do you think you'll ever store stormlight in a metal mine?
Will I ever store stormlight in a metal mine? Raffo! First one of the night! Yay! Good job! All right, go ahead.
What technology that you have heard of recently in real life has inspired your fantasy?
Oh, wow. What technology in real life has inspired fantasy? Ooh. Boy. There's got to be something in Skyward, right? Maybe? Obviously, the Legion stories are always, all three of them are inspired by a real-world technology that I read something interesting about, and then go and write a story about. The first one, taking pictures of the past with a camera, not a real-world technology, but I was really reading about photography and things like that. The second one, storing data inside of human cells, that's a real thing. Like that, lots of people are trying to do that. It's very interesting. And I didn't want to do a story about that because I thought other people do stories about that. So I did a story where someone had stored, you haven't read the book, data in a body and then lost it. And then the third one is directly inspired by my kids' love of their VR. So, all right, questions in the middle. Go ahead.
How do you recommend approaching writing different characters' viewpoints?
How do I recommend writing different characters' viewpoints? There's way more advice than I can perhaps give you right here. I would recommend my class. If you haven't gone to it, or if you have you ever gone to it? Well, you should definitely come to my class, or you should watch the lectures on YouTube. But some quick tips. Number one, try to ask yourself, how do they see the world different from the other characters? If you were going to describe a cup of water from their viewpoint, how would they describe something mundane in a different way from the other characters? And the more you can kind of compare and contrast how the different characters see a cup of water, as an example, or anything like that, the more you can kind of get inside their head and make sure when you're describing things the way they would describe them. And that can really distinguish viewpoints from one another, just in the way they offer descriptions. Do their descriptions have a bit of humor in them? Do their descriptions, are they very analytical? Do their descriptions include a lot of emotional attachment to the object or not? Different things like this are really going to help take your narrative, the paragraph by paragraph you write, and put it into a viewpoint so that the character jumps off the page. And the things that are sometimes a little more boring in a story, the descriptions, also are doing the heavy lifting on who your character is. Another good thing to practice is the thing I mentioned earlier. If you can write a sequence with, say, 4 people talking and leave off all the dialogue tags, and a reader is able to follow who all those 4 characters are because of what they're passionate about, the way they approach argument, and their motivations being made manifest in the way that they just talk about something, you're going to be a lot of the way there. Try and put a little bit of that in their viewpoint. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm wondering about with the idea that you can block emotional elements with an aluminum blind pad.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm wondering how much aluminum is required. So like aluminum colander versus aluminum headband versus the most
Right.
one being
All right. So I'll be honest with you. The idea of a tinfoil hat was so intriguing to me, obviously, that I made sure this were part of the magic system. I say it has to be tinfoil at least. Thicker is probably better. The way these things work. And I'll try not to give spoilers, when Hoyd lets somebody use aluminum to block signals, he was going with something that you would be able to bend a little bit by pulling on it, but wouldn't be able to fold it down. And I'd put a bare minimum if you want to be extra sure on that. But lining your hat with tinfoil is viable, particularly in the later eras of Mistborn when some of the power are decreased. So go ahead.
So if a steel compounder
Oh, here
became
we
an
go.
edge dancer,
Oh, here we go. All right. Okay, here we go.
Buckle up.
if a steel compounder became an edge dancer, how fast could they go?
I think the answer is yes. Super duper duper.
They could go quite fast. We are not going to ever reach superhero levels of bending reality for speed, and so I will say quick, but not that quick. You aren't out racing an atom bomb as the Flash periodically does. All right, go ahead.
Me? For the difference between the White Sand prose and the White Sand graphic novel?
Yes.
What was the thought between changing Isis' gender?
Oh yeah, what was the thought between it changes Isis' gender? There were a couple thoughts. The main one was I just thought the character was more interesting. A lot of my early books, you'll notice I did a thing where I'm like, I want to make sure that I'm doing the female character really well. And you can see the problem in that sentence. And that is really how I approached it. I'd say, well, I want to make sure I do the female character really well. And I think I did do the female character pretty well in some of those early books, but you'll see a consistency to them. And this is just kind of one of these things that's becoming aware of your biases. Now, there is nothing wrong with writing a book intentionally and saying, you know what, because of the way I want to write this book in this world, I'm going to make the cast almost all one gender or the other. I don't think there's a problem with that. It's when you're doing it consistently on accident that there's a problem. And I had to kind of sit down and say, did I do this because I thought it was best for the character, or did I do this because I love Inspector Javert and I just want to have Inspector Javert in my book, right? And that's where the character came from, quite obviously. And I sat down and said, well, you know, if I were going to build this character from the ground up to be my own character, and I were trying to throw away all biases, what would be the best for the character? And Iaz being female was not I need more women in the book. It was more if I'm throwing away these biases and building up characters, what works the best? And I just really liked how that character came out when I was rebuilding them. So, anyway, we'll go with that.
So, Cone of Silence, and you and your 200...
Cone of silence between
200
me,
closest
the
friends.
200 closest friends,
Yeah.
and that camera, and perhaps this camera, and that camera.
That all got turned off.
And that camera, yeah.
What can you tell us about Secret Project?
What can I tell you about Secret Project? I can tell you nothing. I really can tell you nothing. I can say exactly what I've said before. I am contractually forbidden from saying because of things I've signed. So take that however you will. Go ahead. If I were a misting, what would I be? What would I actually be? What would I want to be? Because I would want to be a scale pusher, because flying is awesome, right? And even mini flying is awesome. But what would I actually be? I don't know. I sit around a lot, so probably a copper cloud, right? I sit around a lot and think about stuff, and so maybe that, I don't know. Go ahead.
So, in the scene where Kelsier has all...
Oh, no spoiler.
I'm not.
Okay, good.
When he has all the metal around him,
Yes.
right? And he's pushing and pulling on not center of mass. Is that something more along the lines of savantism, or is it just rule of cool?
Well, no, that I was pushing toward. I wouldn't call Kelsier savant, but I would say that there were certainly steps toward that, and it is something I actually wanted people who were really skilled with the magic to be able to do.
So it's not rule of cool.
I would not call that one rule of cool. I would say that I want that to actually be part of the magic. that I wanted to be there to be some level, particularly in pushing and pulling, of skill that lets you deviate from the normal. And I've tried to show in other places that people are really skilled, can do some different things like that, particularly with pushing and pulling, both on emotions and on metals. So no, not rule of cool there. I do occasionally do rule of cool stuff, but I wouldn't call that one. Go ahead.
So, disregarding personal preferences, what order of the Knights Radiant do you think you would best fit as?
Oh man, I've been asked this one and it's really hard. What order of Knight Radiant would I best fit as? It's difficult, right? Because number one, there are a lot of orders, and you can kind of see yourself going in different ways. And number two, there's kind of like the what is it realistically? Like when I sort myself into a Harry Potter house, which is much easier because there's not as many. I always have to kind of grudgingly put myself in Slytherin, right? Because though a lot of my fellow writers are Ravenclaws, I'm not about the study. I'm about the accomplishment, right? Like I write books in part because I'm like, I want to accomplish this thing. And it's ambition, but it's also just, I want to do this thing. And so for that reason, I don't know that I can put myself in any kind of the scholarly focused orders of Knight Radiant realistically, because I don't think that I really actually fit there, even though that would be the natural place to start putting writers. I often wonder, maybe Lightweaver, but the problem is I don't lie to myself, I don't think. Right? But I am really good at fooling myself when I want to. Like when I don't want to deal with something, I'm very good at I'm putting this on the shelf and I'll deal with it later, which is a very Lightweaver thing. Maybe Lightweaver, so we'll go with that one today, but I think I've answered that question 4 different ways in the past. So. All right, we'll go right here. Go ahead.
How do you come up with plots, and how do you deal with writer's block?
How do I come up with plots? Plots happen lots of different ways. Sometimes I take a plot archetype, I watch a whole bunch of films and read a whole bunch of books using a certain plot archetype, and I try to boil it down to what makes it tick. Not just beat by beat, what are they doing, but why are they doing these things? And that can be really, really handy, particularly when you transpose a plot to a different setting or a different genre. A lot of times it comes down to kind of something I talk about in class, so you should watch these. Promise, progress, payoff. And a plot is about making a good promise and the right promise, making progress so the reader knows how it's moving along, and then having a payoff that doesn't quite do what they expected, but somehow does it better. And that is kind of my philosophy on plots. Writer's block. My philosophy on writer's block is write anyway. And it can be hard, and it can be frustrating. And oftentimes when you have writer's block and you write anyway, you hate what you write. But that's how you learn to be a writer, is you learn to push through. And a lot of times for me, when I have writer's block, it's because I need to write the chapter poorly before I can write it the right way. Once I write it poorly, my subconscious starts working on it and says, oh, this specific thing you did was wrong, this specific thing you did was wrong. Now you can actually write this chapter, but if you never write the chapter, you sit and think about what could happen, get more and more intimidated by this chapter that you have to write because it has to be perfect, because now you've spent 2 weeks planning it, and now you spent 3 weeks planning it, and now if I write it, the stress of what this chapter has to be gets further and further. Just write. You know what? The person who changes the oil on your car does not get to have oil changer's block. If you're a coder, you don't get to call and say, I can't code today, I have coder's block. You just don't get to do that. And writers, oftentimes I think what happens is because you stop, and then that momentum stops, and then it becomes its own thing that you feed. I'm not saying writer's block isn't real. I do think it's real, but I also think the way to get over it is to not feed it, because if you do, you're going to end up spending a long time and this chapter is just not going to go anywhere, or this story. All right, there was a question in the back. All right, last one from here. Go ahead. Yes?
Nananov from Oathbringer, World Hopper.
Raffo. Yeah, here's your second Raffo. Okay. Questions over here. Go ahead.
We were just talking the other day about how well planned all the books seem. Like something that seems so nonchalant in book one suddenly is important in the last book. But have you ever? So it seems from the outside so well planned. Have you ever surprised yourself like, wow, I could use that?
Have I ever surprised myself with the, oh wow, I could use that sort of thing? I have before. I think every writer does. I am more of a planner than a lot of writers, and so that happens to me less. It happens more in outlining, where I'm like, I could use that. Let's put that in because I'll use it later, and things like this. And I kind of know what sort of story seeds I need to build into something later on. So I put a lot of them in knowing, but every book you write, you end up saying, oh, you know what would be better is if I did this. And it's less, I don't usually use the phrase, I surprised myself. What I use is the, oh, I should have done this. It would have been way smarter. Fortunately, I can go back and change that. The longer the series gets, the less you can do that, because things have momentum, and so you have to try and trust in those seeds. And I've seen writers change mid-stride to varying levels of effectiveness. You can sometimes pull a reversal in a later book and have it really work, but sometimes you pull it and then the readers are all like, I don't think that was foreshadowed. And so I just try to pay attention to a lot of what other writers are doing and see what works and what doesn't work. All right, question, go ahead in the corner, or I guess by the wall.
Other than writing excuses, of course, any podcasts that you recommend?
Other than writing excuses, what podcast do I recommend? I really like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. I like 99% Invisible. It's a very good podcast. I listen to No Such Thing as a Fish, but that is not a writing podcast. That is just comedians being funny, and they are very funny in a sort of British funny, which I really like. What else do I really like podcast-wise? Freakonomics, the old standby, is surprisingly handy as a writer. I think economics is something that writers have a blind spot for. That's the stuff that we don't want to have to pay any attention to, but it can be very helpful, particularly since Freakonomics does it in a very pop culture sort of way. So yeah, there's a couple of them for you. If you guys haven't listened to Hardcore History, it is really really well done. So it's a very, I haven't been able to find a history podcast as good as that. Lore was really good. The Lore podcast is very good. Yeah, go ahead.
On Threnody, is there more than one metal that affects shades?
On Threnody, is there more than one metal that affects shades? Technically a Raffo. Yes, technically a Raffo. Yeah. Yeah. So there we go. Yeah. I'm not going to dig into that, but yeah.
Two quick ones. Do you still plan to try and hit Wax and Wayne 4?
Do I still plan to try to hit Wax and Wayne 4? So I've got time probably to work on one more project this year, because Skyward 2 is almost done. I'm still not 100% sure what it'll be. It's probably going to be Skyward 3, because it would be super nice to just have that locked up and done. If that's the case, then Wax and Wayne 4 will probably be written in between parts of Stormlight 4 as I'm writing it, as I need breaks. If I can kind of manage the way I take my breaks, that might be helpful for us getting the book out. One of the things I've learned to do is take my breaks as novellas, which is why you see a lot more novellas from me than standalone novels across the last 5 to 10 years. And that's because I realized as I was doing breaks as novels that, number one, it took a lot longer, particularly in revision, and number two, it ended up promising sequels, because I'm incapable of finishing a novel without promising sequels, apparently. But I'm capable of finishing shorter works without promising sequels. And so, but if I can get that, I really do want to get Wax and Wayne 4 done in a reasonable amount of time. But we'll see. So what was the other question?
You mentioned that you thought Earthquake was going to start in the Cosmere. Did you have a shard in mind?
Very early on I did. but I won't tell you who it was. It is not a shark we've seen in.
Of course, that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah. And if I ever do write Arithmetis 2, you might be able to piece it together, though I'm in revisions of the outline really trying to push it away from where it was originally so it'll have a distinctive feel of its own. So I'm trying to write out some of the Cosmere elements, but this is one of those things that if I write it out too much, it just won't match with the first book. And so I have to be okay with some of the sort of Cosmere relationships. Yeah, go ahead.
Mostly not spoilers. In Calamity, and Calamity's part of a mysterious group or civilization, that has really weird motives. We don't find out much about them. Was that going to be in any way part of Apocalypse Guard?
It was.
Oh, or do you have the plan to explain that civilization?
I will someday explain that. If, at the very least, if I just have to sit down and write an essay on it to give the closure. So yes, I will. And I do apologize for that. Apocalypse Guard was going to delve into this, but then the book got canceled by me. So, all right. Other questions? Go ahead.
Do you have any advice for writers who struggle with world-building disease?
Writers who struggle with world builder's disease. So world builder's disease, for those who don't know, is when you sit and you world build and you world build and you world build and you never actually get to the book. Boy, I wish I did. I have some good friends who have been world building their books for 30 years and never read them. And it's interesting because I always get excited by the world building to tell the story to the point that I can't keep world building because I just have to tell the story. And so I don't ever really have a danger of world builder's disease. And so I think it's kind of one of these individual things. And I would be kind of just spitballing if I were to give you suggestions. I can spitball a few things you can try, but I have no real knowledge if they'll work or not. Like for instance, trying to write something off of a writing prompt so that isn't world built, so you're practicing your writing while you're world building this other thing that you're eventually going to tell your big story in, so that you kind of get those bad words behind you on things that you're not quite as worried about. And you'll find that if you just start writing on something, a lot of us, we just really enjoy that story and come to love it. Telling yourself, you know what, I'm going to write this story as part of my world building. Since I wanted world build so much about this war that happened in the past, I'm just going to write a short story set in that war that's not my novel, right? That's just this short story, and then I'll just put that in the notes file. But the goal being to get you to get those bad words out of your system into practice, so that when you do want to write this really great book that you've spent, forever world building, you'll have the chops to do it. There's nothing wrong with world builder's disease unless it bothers you, right? Like Tolkien had world builder's disease, and you can't really fault Grandpa Tolkien. He also did the female character well. Ooh, dang! No, he had to. But he really loved that part of it, and there's nothing wrong with that, unless you're like, I really want to be writing books and I'm not. So ask yourself what motivates you. I think part of becoming a writer, a professional writer, is about learning what motivates you. It's kind of like about what makes you successful in life is learning what motivates you. Ooh, maybe maybe that'll be my talk next time. Because kind of learning to hack your brain, to learn what makes you do the things you know you should do, but in the moment you don't want to do, is kind of about, that's what becoming an adult is all about. And I don't know how many of us are there yet, but it is the way that we learn how to accomplish things. And so what is it that makes it work for you? For me, I'm very motivated by seeing numbers on a spreadsheet count up, which is why you guys get percentage bars, right? We joke about other authors, but people will say to Pat Rothfuss, why don't you have a percentage bar? Well, the answer is he is not motivated by the same things. He doesn't work the same way. He doesn't know what percent done he is, and he doesn't care what percent done he is, because, no, don't laugh at that, because the way he explores a story, he knows it's done when he's done. That's his style and his process, and that's a very valid style. My style and process lends itself very well to how many words do I get, what percent do I think that is. Even if I'm wrong, it's good for me to write that down because then the number takes up. And the next day I'm like, I am that much percent closer to being done. And you'll see that I'm usually wildly off on my percentage bar estimates. But the purpose of doing them is to keep myself going. So what works for you? I do think we're going to stop there. And I'm going to do the reading for you. The reading is from Skyward. You guys have, how many chapters does that thing have in it? 3 chapters. What's that?
Prologue and 3 chapters.
For a prologue and 3 chapters. So I guess you can follow along because I'm going to read chapter 3 right now. For those who haven't read the first 2 chapters, what's happening, I think maybe I'll steal one of those books and read from it. Actually, no, I don't have it. If you haven't read the first ones, you have them in hand. The prologue involves a girl and her father climbing to the surface of their planet, which she's never seen before. And then he, as a starfighter pilot, being called off to fight. And she is always wanted to be a starfighter. And as she is going home, she arrives back home after the fight and finds out that her father fled the battle, kind of famously. I actually will use my copy because mine's newer, I think. So there might be different. You can see if there are differences. That'll be fun. And she's been branded the daughter of a coward. Chapter 1, we start off in chapter 1. When the book comes out, I'll post. I have 3 different versions of chapter 1 for this book. It took forever to get chapter 1 right. And I knew the first chapter was bad the first time I wrote it. And then I tried to write it better, and it was a little better, but still bad. And finally, I hit on the one that works, and I really like this one. She is out now. It's been 9 years. She's out pretending that she imagines herself as this great warrior, but really she's hunting rats for food because her family sells rats because her family is kind of outcast now because her father was a coward. And she brings the rats home, and her mother, her grandma, she sits on the top of their house, and Gran tells her stories about Beowulf and some of the people from old Earth. Chapter 2, she goes to class, which she's missed part of, but she doesn't care because she's going to be a pilot. She's going to take the pilot's test, and who cares if about all these other things you have to learn in class because pilots don't need that stuff. But she finds out in class that she's been forbidden from taking the pilot's test, and if she does take it, she will fail because they do not want the daughter of a coward to fly. And so it's not a happy moment for Spencer, and she kind of runs off into the caverns and is angry at everything. So we're starting right there. I sought refuge in the silent caverns. I didn't dare go back to my mother and grandmother. My mother would undoubtedly be happy. She'd lost a husband to the Krell and dreaded seeing me suffer the same fate. Gran, she would tell me to fight. But fight what? The military itself didn't want me. I felt like a fool. All this time telling myself I'd become a pilot, and in truth, I'd never had a chance. My teachers must have spent these years laughing at me behind their hands. I walked through an unfamiliar cavern on the outer edge of what I'd explored, hours away from Igneous. And still the feelings of embarrassment and anger shadowed me. What an idiot I had been. I reached the edge of a subterranean cliff and knelt, activating my father's light line by tapping 2 fingers against my palm, an action the bracelet could sense. It glowed more brightly. Gran said we'd brought these with us to Detritus, but they were pieces of equipment used by explorers and warriors of the whole human space fleet. I wasn't supposed to have one, but everyone thought it had been destroyed when my father crashed. I placed my wrist against the stone cliff and tapped my fingers on my palm once more. The command made an energy line stick to the rock, connecting my bracelet to the stone. A 3-finger tap let out more slack. Using that, I could climb over the ledge, rope in hand, and lower myself to the bottom. After I landed, a 2-finger tap made the rope let go of the rock above and snap back into the bracelet housing. I didn't know how it worked, only that I needed to recharge it every month or 2, something I did in secret by plugging into 2 power lines in the caverns. I crept into a cavern filled with curry mushrooms. They tasted foul but were edible, and rats loved them. This would be prime hunting ground, so I turned off my light and settled down to wait. listening intently. I had never feared the darkness. It reminded me of the exercise Gran taught, where I floated up toward the singing stars. You couldn't fear the dark if you were a fighter, and I was a fighter. And I was going to be a pilot. I looked upward, trying to push away those feelings of loss. Instead, I was soaring toward the stars. And again, I thought I could hear something calling to me, a sound like a distant flute. A nearby scraping pulled me back. Rat nails on stone. I raised my spear gun, familiar motions guiding me, and engaged a smidgen of light from my light line. The rat turned in a panic toward me. My finger trembled on the trigger, but I didn't fire as it scrambled away. What did it matter? Was I really going to go on with life like nothing had happened? Usually exploring kept my mind off my problems. Today they kept intruding like a rock in my shoe. Remember that your dreams have just been stolen? I felt like I had in those first days following my father's death, when every moment, every object, every word reminded me of him and the sudden hole inside of me. I sighed, then attached the end of my light line to my spear and commanded it to stick to the next thing it touched. I took aim at the top of another cliff and fired, sticking the weightless growing rope in place. I climbed up, my spear gun rattling in its straps on my back. As a child, I'd imagined that my father had survived his crash, that he was being held captive in these endless, uncharted tunnels. I imagined saving him, like a figure from Gran stories, Gilgamesh or Joan of Arc or Tarzan of Greystoke, a hero. The cavern trembled softly as if in outrage, and dust fell from the ceiling. An impact up on the surface. It was close, I thought. Had I climbed so far? I took out my book of hand-drawn maps. I've been out here for quite a while now, hours at least. I'd taken a nap a few caverns back. I checked the clock on my light line. Night had come and gone, and it was already approaching noon of the day of the test, which would happen in the evening. I probably should have headed back. Mom and Gran would worry if I didn't show up for the test. To hell with the test, I thought, imagining the indignation I'd feel at being turned away at the door. Instead, I climbed up through a tight squeeze into another tunnel. Out here, my size was, for once, an advantage. Another impact rocked the caverns. With this much debris falling, climbing to the surface was definitely stupid. I didn't care. I was in a reckless mood. I felt, almost heard, something driving me forward. I kept climbing until I finally reached a crack in the ceiling. Light shone through it, but it was an even, sterile white, not orange enough. Cool, dry air blew in also, which was a good sign. I pushed my pack ahead of me, then squirmed through the crack and out into the light. The surface. I looked up and saw the sky again. It never failed to take my breath away. A distant skylight shone down on a section of the land, but I was mostly in shadow. Overhead, the sky sparkled with a shower of falling debris, radiant lines like slashes. A formation of 3 Scout-class starfighters flew through it, watching. Falling debris was often broken pieces of ships or other space junk, and the salvage from it could be valuable. It played havoc with our radar, though, and could mask a Krell incursion. I stood in the blue-gray dust and let the awe of the sky wash over me, feeling the peculiar sensation of wind against my cheeks. I'd come up close to Alta Base, which I could see in the distance, maybe only a 30-minute walk or so away. Now that the Krell knew where we were, there was no reason to hide the base, so it had been expanded from a hidden bunker to several large buildings with a walled perimeter, anti-aircraft guns, and an invisible shield to protect it from debris. Outside that wall, groups of people worked in a small strip of something I always found strange. Trees and fields. What were they even doing over there? Trying to grow food in this dusty ground? I didn't dare get close. The guards would take me for a scavenger from a distant cavern. Still, there was something dramatic about the stark green of those fields and the stubborn walls of the base. Alta was a monument to our determination. For 3 generations, humankind had lived like rats and nomads on this planet, but we would hide no longer. The flag starships streaked toward Alta, and I took a step after them. Set your sights on something far higher, my father had said. Something more grand. And where had that gotten me? I shouldered my pack and my spear gun, then hiked in the other direction. I had been to a nearby passage before, and I figured that with more exploring, I could connect some of my maps. Unfortunately, when I arrived, I found the passage's mouth completely collapsed. Some space debris hit the surface in the near distance, tossing up a spray of dust. I looked up and saw a few smaller chunks streaking down overhead, fiery chunks of metal. Heading straight for me? Scud! I dashed back the way I had come. No! The air rumbled, and I could feel the heat of the approaching debris. There, I spotted a small cavern opening in the surface, part crack, part cave mouth. I threw myself toward it, skidding and sliding inside. An enormous crash sounded behind me, and it seemed to shake the entire planet. Frantic, I engaged my light line and slapped my head against stone as I fell in the churning chaos. I jerked up short, connected by the light line to the wall, as rock chips and pebbles flew around me. The cavern trembled. Then all grew still. I blinked dust from my eyes and found myself dangling by my light line in the center of a small cavern, maybe 10 or 15 meters high. I'd lost my pack somewhere, and I'd scraped up my arm pretty good. Great, just great, Spencer. This is what throwing a tantrum gets you. I groaned, my head throbbing, then tapped my fingers against my palm to let the light line out, lowering myself to the floor. I flopped down, catching my breath. Other impacts sounded in the distance, but they dwindled. Finally, I wobbled to my feet and dusted myself off. I managed to locate the strap of my bag sticking out from some rubble nearby. I yanked it out, then checked the canteen and maps inside. They seemed okay. My spear gun was another matter. I found the handle, but there was no sign of the rest. It was probably buried in that mound of rubble. I slumped down against the stone. I knew I shouldn't go up to the surface during debris falls. I had practically begged for this. A scrambling sound came from nearby. A rat? I raised the handle of my gun immediately and then felt doubly stupid. Still, I forced myself to my feet, slung the pack over my shoulder, and increased the light of my bracelet. A shadow ducked away, and I followed, limping only a little. Maybe I could find another way out of here. I raised my bracelet in the air, illuminating the cavern. My light reflected off of something ahead of me. Metal? Maybe one of the water pipes? I walked toward it, and it took my brain a moment to realize what I was seeing. There, nestled into the corner of the cavern, surrounded by rubble, was a ship. And there we go. All right, so Skyward comes out November 3rd, 6th, that's what I meant, November 6th.